Hey everybody, this is a piece from the book Stalinism, Essays and Historical Interpretation with a new introduction by the editor Robert C. Tucker. What year is this from? 1999. Oh no, originally published in 1977. So, the piece that I'm reading from this is Trotskyist Interpretations of Stalinism by Robert H. McNeal. Quote, Stalinism is the syphilis of the workers' movement, end quote. Footnote. All writings referred to in this paper are by Trotsky unless otherwise noted. Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1937-38. The title of this series is hereafter abbreviated Writings of Leon Trotsky. End footnote. Thus did Trotsky, near the end of his life, sum up the phenomenon that had defeated not only his political aspirations, but also his attempts to comprehend it. There is no point in asking with whom the working class movement had been consorting, nor otherwise subjecting the metaphor to literary criticism. It is simply a cry of anguish from a man who deeply believed in human progress, most particularly in the progressive meaning of his life as a revolutionary, and could not come to terms with the cruel irony that confronted him in Stalin's Russia and Comintern. Although Trotsky once denied any, quote, subjectivity and sentimentalism, end quote, in fact, the possibility of rejecting his own October Revolution, even maintaining that, quote, old Freud, end quote, would agree with him on this. Trotsky would have been more than human if he had not felt anguish, rage, and frustration concerning Stalinism. The problem can be compared to theodicy. Marxism, like mainstream Christianity, assumes a fundamental long-term benignity of the universe towards human beings. Also, like Christianity, Marxism faces the problem of squaring this assumption with the woeful state of man in the present and most of the past. Unlike Christian theology, Marxism finds the answer to this problem in the dialectic, the idea that contradiction not only is in the nature of things, but is the dynamic that eventually lifts man to ever higher levels and eventual fulfillment. It is both psychologically understandable and philosophically sound that Trotsky in his last months engaged in a passionate defense of the dialectic as the key to any revolutionary thought. Without it, the critic of the existing order is doomed to pessimism. If the dialectic could explain how capitalism at its worst is the prologue to the first truly human stage of civilization, then surely it could handle the problem of Stalinism. But how? Trotsky did not face the question in any summa. What the fuck that means. And the internet's not working. But Trotsky did not face the question in any summa, starting with the most fundamental philosophical questions, partly because Trotsky had never been much given to this kind of work, partly because of his continual hope that Stalinism was ephemeral and would soon disappear, and partly because Trotsky was dealing with a living historical problem that evolved as it was observed. What we have from Trotsky, then, is a lot of writing about Stalinism over many years, displaying some fundamental continuity but also alternative formulations, shifts of opinion, even self-contradictions. Since Trotsky was more a brilliant theoretical journalist than a philosopher, it would not be fair to the man in his mind to present Trotsky's concept of Stalinism as if it were a fixed integrated whole. What follows is an attempt to describe the evolution of Trotsky's thinking about Stalinism in two main periods, granting that there are some elements that cut across these divisions and others that are not quite stable within them. The first of these periods runs from the intra-party struggle in the mid-1920s when Trotsky first began to speak of Stalinism to 1935. The period is characterized by Trotsky's frequent and consistent use of the word, quote, centrism, end quote, to describe Stalinism. As explained by Trotsky, the term centrism characterizes, quote, all of those trends within the proletariat and on the proletariat's periphery which are distributed between reformism and Marxism, and which most often represent various stages of evolution from reformism to Marxism and vice versa, end quote. Trotsky. Nevertheless, that's from the struggle against fascism in Germany. Nevertheless, it is rooted in the proletariat. Centrism occurs in times of relative prosperity or of the ebbing of revolution when, quote, different layers of the proletariat shift from politically left to right, clashing with other layers who are just beginning to evolve to the left, end quote. Centrism, quote, in general, end quote, serves as a, quote, left cover for reformism, end quote. Such a highly pejorative interpretation of Stalinism occurs in Trotsky's writings in the later 20s, in which he drew an analogy between Stalinism on the one hand and Menshevism and German Social Democrats on the other. The German Social Democrats and the Mensheviks parallel was particularly attractive to Trotsky because the, quote, National Socialist, end quote, betrayal by the German Social Democrats in 1914 could be compared with Stalin's, quote, national messianism, end quote, and, quote, social patriotism, end quote, in exchanging internationalism for, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. Trotsky, the Third International after Lenin. But Trotsky was not consistent in equating Stalinism and Menshevism. In the early 30s, Trotsky explicitly gave Stalin credit for standing on the left side of centrism, apart from the Mensheviks. Quote, there exist only two firm and serious lines, the line of the imperialist bourgeoisie and the line of the revolutionary proletariat. Menshevism is the democratic mask of the first line. Stalinism is the centrist deformation of the second. End quote. Deformed but in good company. On another occasion, Trotsky explained that Rosa Luxemburg's disagreements with Lenin were also centrist and in this sense resembled Stalin, even though, quote, he did not come up to her knees, end quote, quote, politically, theoretically, or morally, end quote. Footnote. Or that's from the struggle against fascism in Germany as well, which refers to Stalin's, quote, Bolshevism, end quote. It's also in the Leon Trotsky's, the works of Leon Trotsky published, the works of Leon Trotsky, 1932. Anyway, back to the text. This placement of Stalinism within the framework of proletarian rather than bourgeois politics was in keeping with Trotsky's attitude toward the party in this period. Steadfastly rejecting the validity of his expulsion from the party in common turn, Trotsky thought of his own faction before and after expulsion as the, quote, left opposition, end quote, within the movement. Whatever Stalinists might say, Trotsky considered himself their party comrade, whose criticism was partly responsible for the, quote, left turn, end quote, associated with the first 5-year plan and collectivization. Trotsky even seemed eager to associate himself with policies that most historians consider Stalinist. In particular, the destruction of the kulaks, which Trotsky considered insufficiently thorough, and the first major political trials, Shakti and the Mensheviks. I don't know who Shakti is. I'm going to look that up. See if my computer will cooperate. There we are, the Shakti trial. The Shakti trial was the first important Soviet show trial since the case of the Socialist Revolutionary Party in 1922. 53 engineers and managers from the North Caucasus town of Shakti were arrested in 1928 after being accused of conspiring to sabotage the Soviet economy and the former owners of the coal mines. The trial was conducted on May 18, 1928, in the House of Trade Unions, Moscow. 34 of the accused received prison terms, while 11 were sentenced to death, with 6 being executed. The rest received commutations. The remainder were acquitted or received suspended sentences. That's the Shakti trial. I guess I should look up the Mensheviks trial as well. The 1931 Menshevik trial. The Menshevik trial was one of the early purges carried out by Stalin, in which 14 economists who were former members of the Menshevik Party were put on trial and convicted for trying to reestablish their party as the, quote, Union Bureau of Mensheviks, end quote. It was held from the 1st to the 8th of March 1931 in the House of Unions. The presiding judge was Nikolai Zvernik. In 1930, Trotsky was quite willing to contemplate political coalition with Stalin, hardly out of any personal attachment, but because he considered himself and Stalin to be members of the same proletarian party, sharing some degree of the cause of resistance to truly bourgeois right-wing trends. Trotsky's conception of the right was not the same as Stalin's. Stalin attached this label to Bukharin and his associates. Both before and after Stalin split with Bukharin, Trotsky accepted Bukharin as part of centrism, albeit a much less important part after his fall from the Politburo. In fact, Bukharin and Rykov were among those whom Trotsky seemed willing to join forces against the right in 1930. The right, as Trotsky conceived it in this period, was headed by persons whose power bases were not really in the party at all. Military figures such as Voroshilov and Tukhachevsky. Or Chekists such as Yagoda and Deribas. Okay. Clement Voroshilov. Shit, I can't do all these actually references. Sorry, there's like too many. The paragraphs are long. I'll have to look them up in my own time. Anyway, typically Trotsky did not speak of leadership in this connection, but simply referred to Ustrolovists, anonymous Soviet adherents of the emigre publicist, who maintained that capitalism would be restored by the Soviet regime, or, quote, the Besedovskys and Agabekovs, end quote, diplomats who defected to the capitalists. Such out-and-out traitors represented the right in Trotsky's thinking. In his somewhat fantastic perception of the USSR in the late 20s and early 30s, Trotsky's main concern was less Stalinism itself than the danger that Stalinism would be replaced by the right. Trotsky perceived the, quote, formation of a bourgeois party at the right wing of the CPSU, end quote. It was this, quote, party, end quote, that Trotsky usually had in mind when he spoke of Thermidor and Bonapartism up to 1935. True, Trotsky had spoken of Thermidor or the pressing danger of Thermidor in the debates of 1926 to 27, but Trotsky soon repented this and even denied in 1932 that he had ever called the regime Thermidorian. Footnote: the Stalin School of Falsification, end footnote. Trotsky's point was that the threat of Thermidorian or Bonapartist takeover was serious, but he did not identify the existing Soviet regime, Stalinism, with this right-wing menace. By 1933, Trotsky would grant that the division between Thermidorians and non-Thermidorian elements passed through the apparatus and not between the apparatus and the other military bureaucratic kulak interests. But the main thrust of his argument in 1923 to 1933 separated Stalinism and Thermidor or Bonapartism. The transition from the workers' state to Thermidor/Bonapartism, Trotsky argued in 1931, must involve a violent overthrow, civil war. Since these had not been seen in the USSR, one could deduce that there was as yet neither Thermidor nor Bonapartism. When the left communist Hugo Urbans proposed in 1933 that the Soviet Union was Bonapartist, Trotsky rebuffed Urbans with the verity that all Bonapartism is based on bourgeois property, and this had not been restored in the USSR. It says Hugo Urbans, 1890 to 1946, was a German communist revolutionary and politician. Hugo Urbans was involved in the Communist Party of Germany in the 1920s. Hugo Urbans was jailed for his role in the Hamburg Uprising of 1923 and spent time on hunger strike. Hugo Urbans was expelled from the KPD in the late 1920s and became a leader of the Lenin Bund, a left split from the KPD. For a time, Hugo Urbans had links with Leon Trotsky, but they drifted apart after a number of issues, including Urbans' development of, quote, third campist, end quote, positions that the Soviet Union was no longer a workers' state. Back to the text. Granted, the Stalinist regime was, quote, plebiscitary, end quote, in Trotsky's repeated expression, and in March 1932 he predicted that the Red Army would support Stalin against the party. Quote, this is a new stage in the systematic, planned, persistent preparation of Bonapartism, end quote. But all this was potential rather than actual, and there was always the hope that the Soviet working class would defeat this bourgeois counter-revolution. In Trotsky's perception, quote, bureaucratism, end quote, was common to both Stalinist centrism and the Thermidorian Bonapartist right. Trotsky's discussion of the category is either very subtle or not very consistent. At times, bureaucratism is treated as a major foundation of the right-wing danger, linked directly to the resurgence of the, quote, proprietors, end quote, the neo-bourgeoisie. In this context, the bureaucracy was largely anti-Stalin, because his left turn had betrayed their rightist expectations. At other times, Stalinist centrism is considered to be intrinsically bureaucratic, rising as a third force above the proletariat and the Thermidorian Bonapartist wings of the party. There probably is a contradiction here, but given the promiscuous use of the word, quote, bureaucratism, end quote, in communist and other literature, one should not be too hard on Trotsky on this account. Finally, Trotsky's perception of Stalinism in the late 20s and early 30s acknowledged the regime was building socialism. For all Trotsky's continued fulminations against, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, there was little difference between Trotsky and Stalin on this issue, a debate into which Trotsky was foolish to have been drawn. The narrowness of the gap between Trotsky and Stalin on the possibility of building one's socialism in one country is revealed by Trotsky's remarkably favorable statements about the about the development of socialism, even under, quote, bureaucratic centrist, end quote, leadership. Quote, successful socialist construction is proceeding in the USSR, end quote, Trotsky wrote in 1930. Quote, academically, it is understood one can construct within the boundaries of the USSR an enclosed and internally balanced socialist economy, end quote. Footnote. That quote's from the Third International after Lenin, page 54. And it says, to be sure, Trotsky repeatedly denied that the Soviet Union had actually built socialism. End footnote. Trotsky's point in this relatively pro-Stalinism phase was not that socialism was not being built in the USSR, but that socialism was vulnerable to a counter-revolutionary overthrow because of capitalist encirclement and domestic hostile elements. The road to socialism would be blocked if, quote, those in charge of industry on one hand and the top strata of workers on the other break loose from party discipline, end quote. The whole outlook resembles very closely what is usually regarded as the Stalinism of this period. Successful socialist construction, the danger of capitalist encirclement, the need for party discipline, and vigilance against domestic class enemies. Trotsky fundamentally changed his mind about Stalinism by the beginning of 1935. The central point of Trotsky's new conception of Stalinism was that it would be classified as, quote, should be classified as, quote, Bonapartism or, quote, Thermidor. Trotsky acknowledged that this was a direct contradiction of his previous interpretation of the analogy with the French Revolution, while attempting to deny that he had really changed his mind very much. Quote, it is not a question of changing our principled position, but only a question of rendering it more precise, end quote. The category of, quote, centrism, end quote, which he had used in the previous period was now quietly dropped with reference to Stalin. The last such usage that occurs in his published works appears to be in October 1933. Since there is no specific and generally accepted system of cross-reference between the framework of the politics of the French Revolutionary era and the politics of 20th century socialism, it does not appear that Trotsky was logically obliged to drop the label, quote, centrism, end quote, when adopting the label, quote, Bonapartism or, quote, Thermidor. That Trotsky chose to replace, quote, centrism with, quote, Bonapartism, end quote, or, quote, Thermidor, end quote, as a standard characterization of Stalinism seems to be the result of his generally darkening appraisal of the situation in Soviet and world communism. Shortly after the establishment of Nazi power in Germany in January 1933, Trotsky argued that the docile acceptance of Hitler by the Comintern signaled its demise. The Soviet Communist Party, too, had in effect ceased to exist. Stalin's policies were in general taking a right turn, and police repression was increased. The idea that Stalinism was part of the proletarian and Marxist camp was no longer something Trotsky could stomach. In a private letter of October 10, 1937, Trotsky explained that, quote, Stalinism is no longer centrism, but the crudest form of opportunism and social patriotism, end quote. It's from Trotsky's, the writings of Leon Trotsky, 1933 to 1934. The change from a conceptual framework directly associated with social democratic policies to one based on the French Revolution posed various problems for Trotsky. For one thing, Trotsky never delved deeply into the history of the French Revolution or Karl Marx's writings on Bonapartism, more Louis than Napoleon, so that, quote, Bonapartism, end quote, or, quote, Thermidor, end quote, as a model remained quite sketchy. Trotsky variously stated that there was, quote, young and, quote, old Bonapartism, that Stalin represented the Bonapartism of the rising bourgeoisie, that Stalinism resembled the Bonapartism of the first consulate, that it was closer to the empire than the consulate, that, quote, the scientific sociological definition of Bonapartism, end quote, is that a, quote, savior, end quote, leader preserves the, quote, new property forms by usurping the political functions of the ruling class, end quote. Trotsky. Wikipedia says, the consulate was the top-level government of France from the fall of the Directory in the coup of 18th Brumaire on the 10th of November 1799 until the start of the Napoleonic Empire on the 18th of May 1804. By extension, the term the Consulate also refers to this period of French history. During this period, Napoleon Bonaparte, as first consul, established himself as the head of a more authoritarian, autocratic, and centralized republican government in France while not declaring himself sole ruler. Due to the long-lasting institutions established during these years, Robert B. Holtman has called the consulate, quote, one of the most important periods of all French history, end quote. By the end of this period, Napoleon had engineered an authoritarian personal rule now viewed as military dictatorship. The application of the concept, vague as it was, to the Soviet Union involved some problems of social observation. Trotsky's main effort in this work, The Revolution Betrayed of 1936, written in the difficult conditions of near isolation in Norway, is a pioneer work in describing the emergence of a new elite in Stalin's Russia, but it has serious shortcomings. Trotsky was intent upon proving the social roots of the new privileged elements were in the old bourgeoisie, which simply was not the case with respect to most of the new elite. This being so, Trotsky was obliged to overemphasize the diplomatic corps as a sample of the new elite. The corps did include ex-bourgeois persons in the 30s, just as it had in Lenin's time, but it surely was an unrepresentative group within the new managerial military political elite. On a humbler level, Trotsky imagined that there was an influential class of well-to-do collective farmers in Stalin's Russia, the immediate heirs to the kulaks. As for the party itself, Trotsky had very little to say, because he either lacked data or was embarrassed by the degree to which its members really were proletarians and peasant in origin, and even to a considerable extent in occupation. Generally speaking, Trotsky had little to say about the party as an institution, apart from broad generalizations about the morally edifying role that a real proletarian party should play. The impression that Trotsky's conception of Soviet Bonapartism or Thermidor is more polemical than analytic is enhanced by the difficulties that Trotsky had with the sequential aspects of the two terms as applied to the Soviet Union. In 1935, when he first asserted that Stalinism was a form of Bonapartism, Trotsky openly asked how this could be possible if, in keeping with his previous conceptions, the country had never entered the stage of Thermidor. At this time, he proposed a model that was internally inconsistent. Thermidor had come to Russia in 1924, and the, quote, hypertrophy of bureaucratic centrism, end quote, had gradually led to the establishment of Bonapartism. This formulation not only broke with his previous denials that the revolutionary decline had reached the Thermidorian stage, it also abandoned his thesis of the early 30s that the transition from a worker state to Thermidor must involve a revolutionary overthrow of the revolutionary regime. But Trotsky found himself unable to stick to this analysis. Although Trotsky had characterized Stalinism as Bonapartism in 1935, The Revolution Betrayed, completed in August 1936, contained a substantial chapter on the, quote, Soviet Thermidor, end quote, which Trotsky treated as a rising phenomenon from around the death of Lenin right up to 1936. Later in the same book, Trotsky characterized Stalinism as, quote, Bonapartism, end quote, again, with the implication that this category covered both the present and a number of years past. The overlapping of Thermidor and Bonapartism did not seem to disturb Trotsky in the next few years, although it is fair to say that Trotsky relied mainly on, quote, Bonapartism, end quote. The sense that either label was more a handy epithet than a seriously thought-out theory is enhanced by Trotsky's tendency in 1939 to 1940 to add, quote, totalitarian, end
quote, to his Stalinist vocabulary. This neologism, drawn from bourgeois political science, might have been thoughtfully related to, quote, Bonapartism, end quote, but Trotsky never took up this possibility. To be sure, it is natural enough that Trotsky was attracted by the idea of consigning Hitler and Stalin to the same camp. But Stalinism did not simply equal fascism in Trotsky's perception. Quote, the USSR minus the social structure of the October Revolution would be a fascist regime, end quote. He wrote at the end of 1939, but the point of the statement was that this socialist foundation had not yet been subtracted. This question of the economic base of the USSR was Trotsky's most serious problem with the idea that Stalinism was, as you prefer, Bonapartism, Thermidor, or totalitarianism. As long as Trotsky had maintained that Stalinism was basically within the proletarian camp, it was not so difficult to defend the idea that the Soviet state, the product of the October Revolution, remained basically a workers' or socialist state. Trotsky did in fact maintain this, but in these early years the issue did not seem very pressing in his writings. How different the problem was after Trotsky had characterized Stalinism as something far worse than centrism, something clearly outside the proletarian camp. How would one characterize the USSR as a worker state if the political regime was, quote, Bonapartist, end quote, or worse? But if it was not a worker state, what could one say of the historic role of the October Revolution and the October Revolution's principal hero? This dilemma was highly divisive in Trotsky's relation with his disciples and fellow travelers in the anti-Stalinist left. While many of these people attempted to grasp one horn of the dilemma and acknowledge that Stalin's Russia was not socialist, Trotsky sought to slide between the horns, maintaining that it was a, quote, degenerated, end quote, worker state, but that its nationalized economic base survived as a defense against the restoration of capitalism or the formation of some new form of exploitation. In the debate that Trotsky carried on with such non-Russian Marxists as Laurent, I don't know if that's Lucien Laurent or if that's a misspelling, or I don't know who Laurent is. Ivan Crépieux, Joseph Carter, Bruno Dietzy, Max Shachtman, and James Burnham, it appears that the latter were more imaginative than Trotsky in attempting to apply Marxist analysis. Trotsky rejected their ideas with towering contempt, but also with a literal-minded, mechanical Marxism about which even he seems to have harbored doubts. His basic argument was simply that the economic base in the USSR, a planned economy and nationalized means of production, must mean that the country was a workers' state. Trotsky was willing to grant that the Stalinist bureaucracy was, quote, parasitic, end quote, and consumed a large share of the country's production, but this he considered merely akin to embezzlement rather than the expropriation of surplus product. You know, I'm not sure if I read it somewhere, but I always use the word embezzlement to describe Trotsky's theory of, like, the relationship of, like, inequality within the Soviet Union. Like, his idea was that, like, the bureaucracy was parasitic, like it's been quoted here, and I always use the word embezzlement. Not know if I read it somewhere else first, or if I came up with it on my own. Not came up with it, but, like, seemed like it was an apt word to describe what was the relationship that Trotsky kind of articulated between the bureaucracy and surplus product. But it's good to see it here, so I know I'm not crazy. Another equally semantic solution to the problem was Trotsky's insistence that the new elite be labeled a, quote, caste, end quote, rather than a, quote, class, end quote. Even if the bureaucracy established the, quote, right of parasitism, end quote, according to Trotsky, it would require the, quote, virtual liquidation of the planned economy, end quote, and nationalized ownership to constitute a, quote, new social base, end quote. When Burnham and Shachtman expressed doubts on the helpfulness of the dialectic, Trotsky responded by attempting to reassert his position in dialectical terms, The process of degeneration in the Soviet Union, Trotsky argued, had not gone so far that quantity had changed into quality. Although his writings against these particular heretics in 1939-40 did not offer any particular demonstration of his proposition, one might look back to several of his previous writings for a deductive argument on behalf of the point. The transition of any new class basis for a society, Trotsky had stated in 1936-38, required a violent revolution. Since the Soviet Union had not yet experienced an anti-Stalinist revolution, it followed that its working class base still survived. I'm confused by that sentence. It doesn't seem right. Since the Soviet Union had not experienced an anti-Stalinist revolution, it followed that its working class basis still survived. I think what it means is Stalinist revolution. Okay, I don't know. Right, so that's like the idea that like, in order for an actual counter-revolution to actually have transpired in the Soviet Union, that would require political violence. At least that's what I understand in my limited knowledge. Actually, it's not that limited. I should give myself more credit. To my knowledge of like Trotsky's conception of the USSR, his idea was that since the Soviet Union had not experienced a revolution against the worker state, that like the worker state still existed. Anyway, this seems internally consistent and possibly persuasive within a Marxist frame of reference, but Trotsky exacerbated his quarrel with the, quote, ultra-left, end quote, as he called it, by rather gratuitously defending the Stalinist regime in various aspects that many socialist observers did not find very attractive. The bureaucracy, he wrote in 1934, quote, protects the workers' state with its own peculiar methods, end quote. It seemed that the purge was one of these methods, for in 1937 Trotsky asserted that the very fact that it could, quote, throw thousands upon thousands of the families of the bureaucrats into the greatest poverty, end quote, demonstrated that real bourgeois property rights did not exist in the USSR. Parenthesis. To be sure, this was not all that Trotsky had to say about the purges, but most of his voluminous writing on this topic was in self-defense or on current Kremlinology. It did not relate very closely to the general theory of Stalinism, end parenthesis. Trotsky was willing to give Stalin credit for contributing to the, quote, defense, end quote, of nationalized property, quote, from the all too patient and avaricious layers of this very bureaucracy, end quote. Not only the Stalinist purge, but even the personal dictatorship of one leader seemed to Trotsky to have its positive side. In a polemic against James Burnham, Trotsky noted that the rule of the proletariat could express itself, among other possibilities, quote, through a factual concentration of power in the hands of a single person, end quote. While this is a danger to the rule of the proletariat, quote, at the same time, under certain conditions, end quote, it could be, quote, the only means to save that regime, end quote, i.e. the rule of the proletariat. Trotsky. Much as Trotsky struggled to reject the idea that Stalinism and the worker state were mutually exclusive, he understood the force of this argument all too well, and most particularly understood its depressing implications for Marxist optimism about the long-term prospects for mankind. Trotsky acknowledged that Stalinism might lead to the restoration of a system of class exploitation. There was even a clear danger that this would happen if the workers in Russia remained, quote, isolated, end quote, from other revolutions, and particularly if fascism triumphed in Western Europe. Trotsky's opponents were merely a little premature in their timing. Or was it Trotsky who was belated, as he had been in recognizing the establishment of Thermidor in the late 20s and early 30s? When Trotsky lashed out at Stalinism as, quote, fascism, end quote, a well-known variant on bourgeois rule, as, quote, Bonapartist gangsterism, end quote, when Trotsky stated that the bureaucracy, quote, contains within the bureaucracy self, to a tenfold degree, all the vices of a possessing class, end quote, one senses that Trotsky was nearly ready to agree with his adversaries on the, quote, left, end quote. That Trotsky did not do so seems part attributable to his awareness of the pessimistic conclusions to which such thinking led. If Stalinism really did represent a transition to a new ruling class, while the proletarian revolution in other countries failed to materialize, quote, we should doubtless have to pose the question of revising our conception of the present epoch and the present epoch's driving forces. Have we entered the epoch of social revolution and socialist society, or, on the contrary, the epoch of the declining society of totalitarian bureaucracy, end quote? If the latter, Trotsky admitted that this meant, quote, the foundering of all hopes for a socialist revolution, end quote. Here Trotsky drew back, quote, Marxists do not have the slightest right, if disillusionment and fatigue are not considered, quote, rights, end quote, to draw the conclusion that the proletariat has forfeited its revolutionary possibilities and must renounce all aspirations to hegemony in the era immediately ahead, end quote. Trotsky's refusal to succumb to such pessimism is expressed ideologically in his determination to demonstrate that Stalinism, the degeneration of the workers' state, is a short-term phenomenon, while the proletarian revolutionary movement is bound to revive in the USSR in the long run. The fundamental problem here was to connect the degeneration of the revolution with the heritage of economic backwardness in Russia, without accepting the Menshevik argument that the proletarian revolution had come prematurely to Russia. Trotsky's solution was to place the blame on the German Social Democrats. If the German Social Democrats had made a revolution on time, that revolution would have rescued the Soviet Union from its bureaucratic Stalinist distortions, the evil result of attempting to build socialism in one country. Instead, quote, the Social Democrats rescued the bourgeoisie, end quote. Salvation in this situation could come through the revival of revolution in the West, with the help of the Fourth International and the dialectical development of the Soviet economy. It would only take one serious success on the part of the European left to inspire the Soviet workers to remove the Stalinist bureaucracy. Quote, can we doubt for an instant that, if the Spanish workers had been victorious, and if the French workers had been able to develop their May-June offensive of 1936 to its conclusion, the Russian proletariat would have recovered its courage and overthrown the Thermidorians with a minimum of effort, end quote. Within the Soviet Union, Stalinism was preparing its own demise. The more it developed the economy, and Trotsky gave Stalinism credit for achieving quite a lot, the more the needs of economic development stood in contradiction with the bureaucratic system, leading to a, quote, crisis, end quote, a, quote, second revolution, end quote. Trotsky did not ask himself about the possible pessimistic implications of this application of the classical Marxian analysis of capitalism to Stalinism. If the revolution had been so surprisingly belated in the capitalist countries, for all the economic contradictions, what should one expect of the Soviet system? Trotsky expected the Soviet system's fall. As late as 1939, Trotsky implied that its fall was likely in, quote, a few years or even months, end quote, a theme that he had maintained steadily through the 30s, despite some shifting from one expectation of imminent crisis to a recognition that some stabilization might occur in Stalinism. There's a footnote here that I missed. It says, however, for a different interpretation of the consequences of Soviet economic growth, see Revolution Betrayed, pages 235 to 36, quote, the very dynamic of economic progress involves an awakening of petty bourgeois appetites, not only among the peasants and representatives of, quote, intellectual, end quote, labor, but also among the upper levels of the proletariat, end quote. Perhaps one can square this with the main line of Trotsky's argument by supposing that up to a point, economic growth stimulates appetites, then proves unable to advance fast enough to satisfy them. It's interestingly the total critique of undemocratic lack of, like, it seems like, it's a complete, this is just an opinion from myself, but it seems that there's no notion that this economic growth was the direct product of exploitative, bureaucratically organized planned economy, up to the point of causing tremendous famines in the countryside. And even, I think, in the cases of Ukraine and Kazakhstan, I wouldn't call, for me personally, I mean, not an expert, but it seems wrong to call, the Holodomor, which resulted in, I think, 4 million deaths or something like that, and wasn't just only located to the Ukraine. It also took places in places like Kazakhstan, I believe. Again, I'm not an expert on this. I think you could say, I wouldn't say they were genocides in the sense that they were a deliberate extermination of the Ukrainians or something like that. I think the word genocide kind of gets thrown around kind of loosely to refer to whenever the state is responsible for the deaths of a lot of people, which obviously that's really bad. Holodomor is really bad, but I would not I don't think it had an exterminationist intention, and I think that would be what we call, and I would say the same thing about the millions of people that died in Mao's Great Leap Forward. You can just say that Mao's Great Leap Forward caused the deaths of millions of people without saying there was some kind of genocide. Kind of robs the word genocide of any kind of specificity to the various atrocities amongst the various atrocities that a state or a group of people can commit. Anyway, and I think that's not the case in my main evidence for that is that the next leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, was Ukrainian, and I think that it would be a mistake to just call what happened, the extreme exploitation of Ukraine, as a genocide that resulted in mass famine and was executed on the basis of extreme terror by the state against the peasantry. But I would say that it seems to me that the Soviet Union, even if you're talking about just one area economically exploiting another, it seems to me that you could definitely say that was the case about the Soviet Union's relationship to the breadbasket region of its borders. There was kind of an internal imperialism, I would say, towards Ukraine and other places as well. So what I'm saying is that the kind of growth that's being worshipped by Trotsky in and celebrated or acknowledged despite criticisms of how it came about and shit like that, that growth was dependent on very, very extreme levels of exploitation that could only be maintained through massive coercion. And I mean massive. And when people, anyway, I'm sorry, this is something to do with it. Anyway, the end of the footnote. It says, Let me reread the last sentence I read. As late as 1939, Trotsky implied that its fall, the Soviet system's fall, was likely in, quote, a few years or even months, end quote, a theme that he had maintained steadily through the 30s, despite some shifting from an expectation of imminent crisis to a recognition that some stabilization might occur in Stalinism. This was Trotsky's least prophetic insight, but a very natural human response to the dismal situation he faced in his last years. Trotsky died in 1940, but his movement proved to be remarkably durable, despite the absence of any imposing leader or solid institutional basis. Indeed, the vitality of organized Trotskyism seemed to lie not in unity, but in amoeboid capacity to reproduce by dividing. The factional history of Trotskyism has yet to be written, but it is clear enough that there has never been a time when the diverse Trotskyist groups in the world all have been on good terms with one another. It would require many years and a polyglot team of researchers to track down the recorded statements of all Trotskyist organizations since 1940. This is beyond the reach of the present paper, which rests on a sampling of the pertinent materials, mainly in English and heavily weighted toward the Socialist Workers' Party. This limitation does not, however, appear to be terribly serious with respect to the theme of the paper. The concept of Stalinism within the mainstream of post-1940 Trotskyism, within the mainstream of post-1940 Trotskyism, this problem has not been subject to any serious further exploration. Indeed, the very definition of orthodox Trotskyism rests on the acceptance of Trotsky's interpretation of Stalinism. The numerous disagreements among the orthodox have turned on many issues, but the conception of classical Stalinism, the origins and natures of this degeneration of the worker state in Russia, has not been one of the divisive points. The main theses have been reiterated frequently, but with the scant amplification of reconsideration. The most authoritative and consensual statements of the Trotskyist idea of classical Stalinism were resolutions adopted by the Fourth and Fifth World Congress of the Fourth International, entitled The Rise and Decline of Stalinism and the Decline and Fall of Stalinism. As the latter title suggests, the optimism that Trotsky displayed concerning the end of Stalinism remains an article of faith. In the first years of 1953, the real signs of stress in the USSR and in other communist parties and states encouraged the Trotskyists to think that the end of the era of degeneration and deformation was actually at hand. That this crucial turn should have been precipitated by the death of an individual whose importance Trotsky and his followers had always belittled raised a somewhat awkward point. The resolution of 1954 somewhat gingerly and abstractly tried to deal with this problem by suggesting that Stalin was the link between the socialist base and the bureaucratic superstructure in the USSR, and that Stalin at once represented a guarantee to the bureaucracy of their privileges and to the proletariat that the socialization of the means of production would remain. This theme, however, was not elaborated. But Stalinism, as understood by Trotskyists, did not perish in the aftermath of its namesake's death, which is more compatible with the traditional Trotskyist dissociation of the personality and the, quote, ism, end quote. But if the basic concept of Stalinism is a settled matter among orthodox Trotskyists, its application to the communist states outside the Soviet Union has confronted them with problems of interpretation that cannot be answered by reference to the words of a man who died in 1940. In this area, opinions have varied among Trotskyists drastically at times, and this material is of some interest to the comparative discussion of communist systems. Take a break again.
The initial reaction of Trotskyists to the expansion of Soviet control over Eastern Europe at the end of World War II was not very favorable. In 1939-40, Trotsky, to the indignation of some of his former admirers, supported Stalin's annexations on the grounds that the statization of the annexed economies was a step towards socialization. But this was not the way that Trotskyists perceived the early post-war scene in Soviet-occupied but unannexed Europe. For several years it was maintained in the journal Fourth International, which seems to have reflected the views of a large portion of West European and American Trotskyism at this time, that Stalin had made a typically anti-revolutionary deal with the imperialist powers and was supporting the national bourgeoisies in such countries as Poland and Bulgaria, just as Stalin was suppressing revolution in France and Italy. These governments, it was observed, were mixed communist and non-communist affairs, and their economies were not fully statized. Even Yugoslavia was not exempt from this interpretation before 1948. The states of the buffer zone, as the area was often called by Trotskyists, were the fruits of Stalinist conciliationism with capitalism, but were not themselves Stalinist states. Fourth International, March 1945. This interpretation was revised as the reality of communist power in East Europe became unmistakable. No error was admitted in the previous interpretation, but it was maintained that the pressure of the masses had compelled Stalin to move to the left, statizing more of the economy. Stalinism, it seems, could not be a dynamic revolutionary force, but it could be obliged to carry out a revolution against its will, especially in countries in which bourgeois power was too weak to be propped up. Footnote. Fourth International, June 1948, a long polemic against Deutscher, who considered that Stalin had imposed the revolution from above in Eastern Europe, appears in Fourth International. July-August 1950, George Clark, Leon Trotsky, A New Vindication, end footnote. I have not encountered any substantial attempt by Orthodox Trotskyists to explain just how this was supposed to have worked, probably because it is not easy to find evidence that the workers of, say, Bulgaria were compelling to Stalin to bend to their will. In any case, it was admitted by the end of the 40s that the communist states of the buffer zone, excepting Yugoslavia after 1948, were deformed worker states on the Stalinist model. Quote, deformed, end quote, rather than, quote, degenerated, end quote, because, unlike the USSR, the East European communist states have never experienced the pre-Stalinist worker state. The communist states that did not owe their birth to the Stalinists pose different problems for Trotskyists. The possibility of communist parties that were not Stalinist came naturally to the Trotskyists, who had always considered themselves in this category and had predicted that the future belongs to such organizations. When Tito's break with Stalin surfaced in 1948, the Socialist Workers' Party was quick to send an open letter to the Yugoslav communists, proposing that the two parties enter into discussion with one another and share advice. Footnote, Fourth International, August 1948, end footnote. For the next few years, Trotskyists displayed an avid interest in the Yugoslavs, but were disappointed. The 1951 Congress of the Fourth International adopted a resolution on the Yugoslav question which summed up the ambivalence of this model of de-Stalinization. On one hand, it was formally recognized that the Yugoslavs had broken with Stalin in 1941. The Fourth International reproached itself for having failed to notice this until 1948 and was now only, quote, semi-Stalinist, end quote. The Yugoslav attempt to deal with, quote, bureaucratism, end quote, was appreciated as an attempt to deal with Stalinism, quote, Yugoslav conquest against Soviet bureaucratism, end quote, should be defended by the Fourth International, which should support Yugoslavia in case of war with the Soviet Union and should attempt to form a united front with the Yugoslav communists for specific actions. On the other hand, Yugoslav communism, having partially de-Stalinized, had become, quote, centrist, quote, opportunist, end quote. The official Yugoslav critique of Soviet Stalinism erred in calling the Stalinist system state capitalist. This was before Zhilas's independent publication of The New Class, which even more directly opposed orthodox Trotskyism on this point. The failure of the Titoists to revise their Stalinist attitude toward Trotskyism also rankled. This issue, said the resolution, is a test of whether a given communist party had, quote, definitely and decisively, end quote, surmounted Stalinism. In the next decade, many Trotskyists found fault with the program of workers' councils in Yugoslavia, which were deemed too decentralized for a socialist economy. Sorry, I was looking at if there's anything for Murray Weiss. In 1960, Murray Weiss, who was more or less the chief authority on Russia and East Europe and the Socialist Workers' Party, even maintained that the Yugoslav communists, quote, had never ceased to be Stalinist, end quote. All in all, the case of Tito's Yugoslavia seems to have added nothing but confusion to the Trotskyist concept of Stalinism and what it takes to de-Stalinize a worker state. There's a footnote. This emerged in many short allusions in ISR. It appears, which is, I believe, International Socialist Review. It appears that the decline of interest in Yugoslavia is related to the decline of Michel Pablo's influence in the Fourth International after 1952. Pablo, the General Secretary of the organization, had shown special interest in Yugoslavia at the Second World Congress in 1948. In 1966, ISR accused Pablo of pro-Titoism. End footnote. China presented similar problems. At the time of the establishment of the People's Republic, the few surviving Chinese Trotskyists who had escaped regarded Mao as a Stalinist and his state a result of Stalinist compromise with capitalism. Although this interpretation was printed in Western Trotskyist organs, it was not long before the Western Trotskyist organs began to detect major stresses between Moscow and Peking. In fairness, it must be acknowledged that at least some Trotskyists saw the coming of the Sino-Soviet antagonism far ahead of the non-Marxist observers in the West. At the opening of 1951, Ernest Mandel, writing as Ernest Germain, called attention to these tensions while rightly forecasting that an open split in the near future would be surprising. Later that year, the World Congress of the Fourth International noted this problem and with explicit reference to Yugoslavia, Korea, and China stated, quote, "It is not excluded that certain communist parties with the bulk of their forces can be pushed out of the orbit of the Soviet bureaucracy and can project a revolutionary orientation. From that point, they would cease to be strictly Stalinist parties," end quote. The evolution of Maoism and its independence from Moscow received mixed reviews from Trotskyists. Predictably, Chinese anti-Americanism and anti-Sovietism drew praise, while the cults of two individuals, Stalin and Mao, did not. In recent years, one can find Trotskyist writers who conclude that Mao's China is or is not Stalinist. Footnote. It is Stalinist according to Tony Thomas, Marxism versus Maoism, New York, 1974. Among those arguing the contrary is Nahuel Moreno in Ernest Mandel, 50 years edited, Mandel's edited volume, 50 Years of World Revolution. One second. Nothing coming up for Tony Thomas. Nahuel Moreno was, I believe, an Argentine Trotskyist who had his own international kind of thing. I think H's are silent. Nahuel Moreno was a Trotskyist leader from Argentina. He lived from 1924 until 1987. Moreno was active in the Trotskyist movement from 1942 until his death. End footnote. As a result, a resolution of the 1965 World Congress of the Fourth International, which represented only some of the major Trotskyist faction of the date, leaned toward Mao. The Chinese Communist Party was not, quote, Stalinist in the strict sense of the term, end quote. Mao had not committed great crimes against revolutionaries, and his regime does more than the Soviets to set egalitarianism against bureaucratism. Quote, the material forces that give rise to such a hardened and fully crystallized bureaucracy as appeared in the Soviet Union no longer exist anywhere else in the world, end quote. Trotsky had been right in regarding Stalinism as the result of quote, a completely special combination of forces and circumstances, end quote. So there is no inevitable period of Stalinism following workers' revolutions in China or elsewhere. On the other hand, bureaucratism was a problem in China, which explained why Maoists respected the person of Stalin, quote, the very incarnation of bureaucratism, end quote. The Great Leap Forward had been a disastrous attempt at socialism in one country, a policy that it was hoped had been replaced by, quote, uninterrupted revolution, end quote. As for the Sino-Soviet dispute, most Trotskyists have favored, quote, critical support, end quote, for the Chinese, some factions being more critical and others more supportive. Footnote. The position of the Socialist Workers' Party, USA, is summarized by Joseph Hansen in a polemical article that suggests that only the Pabloists failed to give, quote, critical support, end quote, to the Chinese in the Sino-Soviet dispute. End footnote. In any case, the Sino-Soviet schism, like the earlier Yugoslav case, frequently is hailed as a sign of the breakup of Stalinism. Cuba posed still different problems. With the exception of the Helios group, which has simply regarded feudalism as capitalism, not Stalinism, most American and European Trotskyists have shown remarkable tenacity in attempting to interpret Castro's state as non-Stalinist. Their enthusiasm for it at first is understandable. The July 26 movement had not grown out of a Stalinist communist party. It was socially radical and, wonder of wonders, it initially permitted a small Trotskyist organization to function openly. I don't know when that was, but there was a lot of Trotskyists were put in jail in the Cuban Revolution. This pleasing situation did not last long. Castro suppressed the Cuban Trotskyists from 1961 to 63, merged his July 26 movement with the Communists, grew increasingly dependent on Moscow, and in a major speech of 1966 denounced Trotskyism as, quote, this discredited thing, this anti-historical thing, this fraudulent thing which emanates from elements so clearly at the service of Yankee imperialism, end quote. And this led some Trotskyists. Footnote. Robert J. Alexander, Trotskyism in Latin America. A survey of Trotskyism in Cuba appears between pages 215 and 235. I have that book downloaded. I'd like to read it. This is the only scholarly work that I know of that provides a survey of the factional history of Trotskyism in a large area from its inception to the present, with the partial acceptance of Yves Crépieux. I think that's supposed to be Ivan Crépieux. The origine de Trotskyisme in France. On the world movement, the nearest thing to a satisfactory introduction is Pierre Franck, La Quatrième Internationale. As you know, this piece is from the 70s. As a lot of you know, I've been reading pieces from Robert J. Alexander's book on international Trotskyism. A lot of them I've uploaded, but I haven't made available yet, because it's kind of I feel like the more I spread them out, the more likely people are to actually listen to them. But maybe that's misguided. Anyway, end footnote. This has led some Trotskyists to acknowledge the danger of a drift towards Stalinism, but the main thrust has been remarkably pro-Castro, even while admitting that his attack on Trotskyism was, quote, reminiscent of the frame-up charges in the famous Moscow trials of the 30s, end quote. Just a side note, I believe the trajectory of the U.S. Socialist Workers Party became, I think a lot of people regard it as something of a rump, that shifted from Trotskyism to Fidelista, as some people have regarded it. Also, it seems like their main things that, if you look at if you look at the main things from Pathfinder Press, it's all shit from Malcolm X and Fidel Castro and Che and shit like that. Obviously there's stuff from Trotsky there too, but this warmness towards Cuba in at least large sections of Trotskyism has remained intact. As late as 1972, George Novak, a stalwart of the Socialist Workers' Party, paid the supreme compliment by referring to, quote, a Lenin, a Trotsky, a Castro, end quote. Shit. Yeah, that's from George. That quote's from footnote. George Novak, Understanding History. Sorry, I'm getting a little frazzled. End footnote. The explanation of this puzzling incongruity might be sought in doctrine, Castro's anti-imperialism, and the alleged mildness of bureaucratism in Cuba. However, I am inclined to see it mainly as a pragmatic response to the politics of the 1960s. The rise of the new left in Europe and America offered the Trotskyists unprecedented opportunities for recruitment and united front activities, for many of the new radicals shared the Trotskyist belief in revolutionary militancy and the rejection of Stalinism. Side note from myself, I think this is pretty much the established history of this is what the actual history of the Socialist Workers' Party USA was, is that it had I can't remember the ins and outs of it. The videos are on the channel, but definitely in the 1960s, that was that was the main group that the Socialist Workers' Party was trying to garner favor with, were middle class participants of the middle class radicals, more or less, who supported Cuba and anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and the women's movement and things like that. Which a lot of people, obviously those the introduction of those struggles and frameworks are interesting and important. But that is the sentence that was just said, that the rise of the new left in Europe and America offered the Trotskyists unprecedented opportunities for recruitment and united front activities, for many of the new radicals shared the Trotskyist belief in revolutionary militancy and the rejection of Stalinism. I was going to say also that there was, in the 1970s, there was in the Socialist Workers' Party, there was something, I don't want to say so-called, because I don't know if it's the actual words they use, but the turn to the workers or whatever. The idea that the Socialist Workers' Party needed to, get back into, trade union and working class struggles, and that's where they need to gain recruits. Anyway, almost all new leftists were passionately enthusiastic about the Cuban Revolution and especially its non-Cuban hero Che Guevara. For the Trotskyists to have offended this conviction would have been politically suicidal. The New Left was pleased to overlook the aspects of Castroism that might have been considered Stalinist, so it behooved the Trotskyists to do no less. This represented the least sacrifice with respect to Guevara, who entered the Trotskyist pantheon. He had no substantial record of the anti-Trotskyist statements and died a martyr's death before becoming involved in Cuban tendencies towards bureaucratism or Soviet dependency. Footnote: it appears that Guevara was not uncritical of Trotskyism, but this is not widely known nor publicized by Trotskyists. See Robert J. Alexander's Trotskyism in Latin America. End footnote. All in all, the case of Cuba, which might have defined Stalinism by its opposite, an undegenerated worker state, contributed its share of ambiguity to the Trotskyist conception of Stalinism. I have some Wikipedia entries that I want to look at real quick. The 26th of June movement. The 26th of July movement. The 26th of July movement was a Cuban vanguard revolutionary organization and later a political party led by Fidel Castro. The movement's name commemorates the failed 1953 attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, part of an attempt to overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista. The 26th of July movement is considered the leading organization of the Cuban Revolution. At the end of 1956, Castro established a guerrilla base in the Sierra Maestra. This base defeated the troops of Batista on the 1st of January 1959, setting into motion the Cuban Revolution and installing a government led by Manuel Urrutia Yeo. The movement fought the Batista regime on both rural and urban fronts. The 26th of July movement's main objectives were distribution of land to peasants, nationalization of public services, industrialization, honest elections, and large-scale educational reform. In July 1961, the 26th of July movement was one of the parties that integrated into the Integrated Revolutionary Organization, ORI, as well as the Popular Socialist Party, PSP, and the 13th of March Revolutionary Directorate. On the 26th of March 1962, the party dissolved to form the United Party of the Cuban Socialist Revolution, PURSC, which held a communist ideology. And it says that George Novak was an American Marxist theoretician, editor, and activist. That's on Wikipedia. On Marxist.org, it says George Novak lived from 1905 to 1992 and was born in Boston and Harvard educated. Novak was on a successful track in the publishing business when the beginning of the Great Depression radicalized him. George Novak joined the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party in 1933 and a member of its National Committee from 1941, author of many articles and books on Marxist philosophy, including the widely available Introduction to the Logic of Marxism. Back to the text. If Orthodox Trotskyism after 1940 contributed little to the conceptualization of Stalinism, what of the unorthodox? I refer here not to those writers who left the Trotskyist movement or merely were merely were influenced by Trotsky's ideas, but only to those who openly differed with the founder, while still considering themselves disciples in some measure. Such a writer was Max Shachtman, who had been a major figure in American Trotskyism in the 1930s, but broke with Trotsky in 1940 and founded his own group. That would be the Workers' Party. Although Shachtman was on the bitterest terms with the orthodox heirs of Trotsky, quote, epigons, end quote, in Shachtman's pointed allusion to Trotsky's label for Lenin's successors, Shachtman continued to express his admiration for Trotsky and for most of Trotsky's analysis of the degeneration of the worker state and the rise of Stalinism. Trotsky, Shachtman thought, simply had failed to carry his analysis to its logical conclusion. Recognition that Stalin's Russia was not a worker state but a new form of society which Shachtman called, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, or, quote, bureaucratic state socialism, end quote. Footnote. Shachtman's writings on Stalinism are conveniently collected in his book, The Bureaucratic Revolution, The Rise of the Stalinist State. And as you know, Shachtman made a more conservative turn in the 1960s, at least regarding, at the very least regarding U.S. foreign policy and supporting the war in Vietnam, stuff like that. And when he published that book, The Bureaucratic Revolution, The Rise of the Stalinist State in 1962, he edited some of his older works. And anyway, end footnote. Shachtman even suggested that Trotsky was not far from seeing the light near the end of his life. Did not, quote, the USSR in war, end quote, admit the possibility that a new exploiting class would emerge under Stalin? But his desire to emphasize the similarity of his own ideas and Trotsky's did not keep Shachtman from offering a sharp critique of the master's reasoning. The state owned the means of production and exchange in Russia, but this did not demonstrate that it was a workers' state, contrary to what the orthodox Trotskyists and their founders seemed to think. Rather persuasively, Shachtman argued that much of Trotsky's analysis of Stalinism showed precisely that the workers in Russia had lost control of the state. This argument was elaborated in various ways. At one point, Shachtman advanced the thesis that a proletarian state is unlike capitalism in that the latter separates social and political power. While in a proletarian state, in the absence of private property, the social power of the workers is inseparable from their political power. Lose political power, as Trotsky admitted the workers had in Russia, and the workers lose control of the means of production, no more workers' state. A related logic could be seen in post-war Eastern Europe. Surely the bourgeoisie was not in power in the communist countries, but they had never experienced a proletarian revolution, so the proletariat could not be in power. Therefore, the bureaucracy must be in command in its own right. For a number of years, Shachtman denied the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, that the theory of bureaucratic collectivism need be discouraging to socialists. Shachtman did not regard this system as the wave of the future in capitalist countries and the Soviet Union alike, as did Ritzi and Burnham in their somewhat similar but non-Trotskyist books, but remained a Trotskyist in regarding the Stalinist degeneration as an exceptional phenomenon. It was the, quote, barbarism, end quote, that Marx and Engels had predicted as the successor to capitalism should the workers not build socialism soon enough. It was doomed to collapse once true socialism had appeared in other countries as Shachtman hoped it would, but this optimism seemed little justified by Shachtman's appraisal of Stalinism at the opening of the 60s. Shachtman considered the Soviet collectivist bureaucracy to be, quote, robust, ambitious, predatory, self-conscious, socially trained, and a politically well-represented class reality, end quote. It would not withdraw readily and was not to be undermined by its own economic progress, which simply contributed to the, quote, maintenance of the machine of repression, end quote. Shachtman may have scored in his argument with the Orthodox Shachtman may have scored in his argument with the Orthodox concerning the logic of Stalinism and the workers' state, but Shachtman's victory faced him with that dismal reappraisal of proletarian revolution, which neither he nor Trotsky could accept. Another factional leader who regards himself as a disciple of Trotsky, while openly acknowledging theoretical differences with Trotsky, is Tony Cliff, Egil Gluckstein. His group, which is based in Britain, calls itself the International Socialist. This is before the Socialist Workers' Party, UK, I guess. But is generally referred to by Orthodox Trotskyists as the quote state capitalist, the quote state capitalist, end quote, because the principal revision introduced by Cliff is the conception of Stalinism as quote state capitalism, end quote. More than any Orthodox Trotskyist of the post-war period, Cliff has devoted serious research to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, utilizing a wide variety of Soviet sources in his books. The first book being Russia, a Marxist Analysis, and Stalin's Satellites in Europe. Footnote. The former was published in London in 1955 and again around 1964 with the addition of a section on Russia after Stalin. The latter book was published in London in 1952 under the name Egil Gluckstein, which I take to be the author's natal name. It says Gluckstern here, but I believe it's Gluckstein, right? Anyway, end footnote. I'm right, yeah, Gluckstein. Pursuing many of the themes that Trotsky opened in the Revolution betrayed, Cliff sees them leading to the conclusion that the Stalinist bureaucracy is a class in the classical Marxist sense, and that the society is capitalist, but not in the normal sense, owing to the absence of private ownership of the means of production. Like Shachtman, whose writing he snubs, Cliff maintains that the loss of worker control over the economic system in a planned statized economy implies loss of political power. Therefore, a social and not only a political revolution, contrary to Trotsky, is needed to overthrow the state capitalist order. Also, like Shachtman, Cliff calls attention to the signs that Trotsky himself was uncomfortable with his defense of the Soviet Union as a, quote, workers' state, end quote, near the end of his life. Cliff emphasizes that Trotsky's last and unfinished book, The Biography of Stalin, refers to class struggle in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, Cliff recognizes that Trotsky did not adopt the, quote, state capitalist, end quote, interpretation, and concludes that this was the result of Trotsky's, quote, conservative attachment to formalism, end quote. That this was non-Marxist, failing to take into account the, quote, law of combined development, end quote, to which Trotsky himself had contributed much. According to Tony Cliff, this should have led him to understand that reaction need not mean a restoration of traditional capitalism, but might be a, quote, spiral decline, end quote, to a form combining old and new elements. Cliff finds the foundations of the theory of state capitalism more in the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and interestingly, for few Trotskyists have shown much regard for him, Bukharin, than in the works of Trotsky. Cliff sees state capitalism as a transitional form which is practically impossible before the proletarian revolution, but quite possible after the proletarian revolution has statized ownership. Its mission is to complete the task of capital accumulation, after which it will fall victim to, quote, a new glorious edition of the proletariat revolution on a much stronger base than in 1917, end quote. Cliff offers a hypothesis concerning the reasons for the unexpectedly long delay in this upheaval. Cliff acknowledges that during the early stage of Stalinist industrialization, many of the ablest workers took advantage of the opportunities for upward mobility and left the working class, while raw recruits flooded in. With the diminution of such expansion, one can look forward to a more militant working class. This characteristic Trotskyist optimism regarding the future of Soviet society would be more persuasive if Cliff's substantive writings about the USSR had identified signs of a growing disaffection of the industrial workers. In fact, he has merely shown that opportunities for upward mobility have diminished and that even official Soviet sources reveal some degree of worker dissatisfaction with assembly line labor and managerial practices. Cliff acknowledges that real income has increased, but maintains that this simply increases expectations. In the main, his discussion of the problems of Soviet Russia follow the lines on non-Marxist Sovietologists dealing with such issues as agricultural productivity and the disaffection of minority nationalities. This seems sound enough, but it is hard to see why much of it should be called a, quote, Marxist analysis, end quote. Nor has Cliff illuminated the long-term historical issues connected with a Marxist analysis of Stalinism. From a few brief references, one would gather that he is willing to accept the Menshevik argument that Russia after 1917 had to experience a period of capitalism in order to complete the task of accumulation. On the other hand, Cliff refers to, quote, the worker state of Lenin and Trotsky, 1917 to 1923, end quote, without explaining whether this was an alternative path to state capitalism or simply a utopian effort of leaders who failed to understand the imperatives of history. Still more confusing, Trotsky refers in passing to the Great Purge of the 30s as a, quote, civil war, end quote, between the bureaucracy and the workers, in which the bureaucracy won and thus restored capitalism, albeit in new statized form. This not only suggests that the worker state lasted well beyond 1923, but also contradicts all the evidence about the relative roles of the workers and bureaucrats in the purge. Surely it was the bureaucrats who bore the brunt, while the former showed no signs of revolutionary resistance of the sort that would characterize any recognizable form of civil war. I'm not particularly sure about this, but I think subsequent research has shown that the purges and the terror extended way more down into the bottom rungs of society and was not exclusively located within the top political spheres of the Soviet bureaucracy. Especially, yeah. What was I going to say? But it does seem that the argument that there was some kind of civil war between the workers and the Soviet state in the 1930s, in some way that was not just that seemed that the word civil war for Stalin's so-called revolution from above seems super dubious. So I agree with McNeal, but I will just add that it seems like the terror definitely extended far beyond just top Bolshevik personnel. Back to the text. In a sense, then, the, quote, state capitalist, end quote, interpretation of Stalinism is more optimistic than Trotsky's concept of the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote. At least Marxism provides a general theory that forecasts the overthrow of capitalism in general, which presumably includes state capitalism, while it is hard to know what hope Marxism offers concerning the process of socialist restoration in a degenerated worker state, or for that matter in Shachtman's, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, regime. On the other hand, Cliff's study of Stalinist society, which Cliff considers to have survived its founder, reveals scant sign of impending revolution. One may deduce proletarian revolution from his general theory, but this seems little supported by his inductive labors. Isaac Deutscher seems to have departed from any form of organized Trotskyism shortly after appearing in 1938 at the founding Congress of the Fourth International, which he regarded as a fiasco. Nevertheless, Deutscher remained a great admirer of Trotsky and became in effect his authorized biographer. For Natalia Sedova granted Deutscher the sole exception to the ban on using a large part of the Trotsky archives before 1980. In his address at her graveside in 1962, Deutscher acknowledges that he was, quote, unorthodox, end quote, but his eulogy confirmed his commitment to his own kind of Trotskyism. One of Deutscher's great assets, his fluent, elusive, and metaphorical style in a language that he learned as a mature man, is an obstacle to the analysis of his ideological position. For example, Deutscher's use of Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor to explain Stalin's purge is an eminently readable and psychologically suggestive device. But it is difficult to compare ideas presented in this way with the more literal theoretical writing of the Marxist tradition. Although the word, quote, Deutscherism, end quote, appeared in Trotskyist publications, Deutscher's work is really too little structured to become an, quote, ism, end quote. And the following sketch to some extent imposes on Deutscher a doctrinal clarity that is absent from most of Deutscher's writings. Deutscher accepted the fundamental Trotskyist conviction that Stalinism was a regrettable detour on the road from the proletarian revolution of October 1917 to the achievement of socialism. Like Trotsky, Deutscher found the terminology of the French Revolution helpful in understanding this phenomenon. Stalinism is a mixture of Thermidor and Bonapartism. Deutscher, unlike Trotsky, would add Jacobinism. Footnote: Deutscher, Russia in Transition, 1957. In The Prophet Outcast, 1963, Deutscher takes a somewhat different tack, suggesting that, quote, such an analogy, bracket Thermidor, and bracket, did indeed serve more to obfuscate than to enlighten, end quote. End footnote. Like Trotsky, Deutscher was ever ready to forecast the downfall of Stalinism and the regeneration of the revolution. Footnote: the most eloquent and perhaps most widely renowned of Deutscher's many statements in this spirit concludes his book Russia After Stalin, published originally in 1953 as Russia, What Next?, but republished in 1963. Quote, for many decades, freedom was banned from Russia because freedom was, or was supposed to be, the enemy of socialism. If Russia had been free to choose her own road, Russia would hardly have marched in the direction in which Bolshevism had led her. But freedom may once again become the ally and friend of socialism, and then the 40 years of wandering in the desert may be over for the Russian Revolution, end quote. End footnote. Like Trotsky, Deutscher attributed the origins of Stalinist detour to the post-revolutionary state of weariness and the insubstantial working class in an immature industrial economy. Footnote: Deutscher, Stalin, 1949, The Prophet Unarmed, 1959, Chapter 1, Ironies of History. Is Ironies of History its own book? Or is that the name of the chapter? I can't tell. It's in italics, so I guess I can assume that it's a book. End footnote. Like Trotsky, Deutscher maintained that the resulting rule of the bureaucracy did not constitute a new class regime in the Marxist sense because the system was still basically a worker state with socialized means of production. Footnote: Deutscher, The Unfinished Revolution, 1967. The degree to which the bureaucracy contradicts the further development of the productive forces of the country increases the likelihood of its reform or replacement. Footnote: Russia After Stalin and The Great Contest and The Unfinished Revolution. End footnote. The objectively impressive growth of the Soviet economy, combined with the innate democratic striving of the proletariat, offers increasing grounds to hope for such a change. All of this constitutes the solid foundation of Trotskyism and Deutscher's perception of Stalinism, but Deutscher modified and extended these ideas. One issue on which Deutscher revised a major orthodox Trotskyist position is socialism in one country. Seeing more clearly than Trotsky the ambiguity in Trotsky's argument on this matter, Deutscher dismissed it as a non-problem or a quibble. This leads to qualified approval of Stalinism, including the cult of personality, as, quote, an amalgamation of Marxism with the semi-barbarous and quite barbarous traditions and primitive magic of an essentially pre-industrial, i.e. not merely pre-socialist, but pre-bourgeois society, end quote. Deutscher, Ironies of History, Stalin, and Russia After Stalin. Odious, it seems, but necessary in view of the backwardness of Russia in 1917. This stress on the historical necessity of Stalin as modernizer, especially an industrializer, seems to be Deutscher's main difference with Trotsky, who was loath to admit that he could have carried out this task. Earlier, there was a reference to the Grand Inquisitor by Dostoevsky, and I don't know what that is, so I'm going to read the introduction to the Wikipedia. The Grand Inquisitor is a story within a story, called a poem by its fictional author, but not in verse, contained within Dostoevsky's 1880 novel, The Brothers Karamazov. It is recited by the character Ivan Karamazov, who questions his brother Alexei, a novice monk, about the possibility of a personal and benevolent God. The Grand Inquisitor is an important part of the novel and one of the best-known passages in modern literature because of its ideas about human nature and freedom and its fundamental ambiguity. In a long diatribe directed at Jesus himself, who has returned to earth in Seville at the height of the Inquisition, the Grand Inquisitor defends the following ideas. Only the principles of the devil can lead to mankind's unification, give man bread, control his conscience, and rule the world. Jesus limited himself to a small group of chosen ones. While the Catholic Church improved on his work and addressed all people, the Church rules the world in the name of God, but with the devil's principles. Jesus was mistaken in holding man in high esteem. Jesus remained silent throughout the Inquisitor's speech. Scholars cite Friedrich Schiller's play Don Carlos of 1787 as a major inspiration for Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, while also noting that, quote, the sources of the legend are extraordinarily varied and complex, end quote. So, learned something about literature today. Russian literature. Dostoevsky. Alright. Back to the text. Thus, Stalinism is a transitional state in which the music is forced towards an advanced level of industry and culture. I think music is peasant. A Russian peasant. Here one has the impression that Deutscher's conception of Stalinism is analogous to the Menshevik idea of capitalism. Both are conceptions of a stage of modernization that cannot be avoided, however distasteful politically. Both Deutscher's interpretation and Menshevism argue for a period of political quietism on the part of true socialists, who must wait for the Stalinist or capitalist stage, respectively, to outlive itself. Trotsky could never stomach such an attitude towards Stalinism or capitalism and continually called for revolutionary forces to prepare for action. But Deutscher was sure that everything would turn out well through the action of the dialectic. Deutscher, to be sure, explicitly rejected Menshevism. Footnote, Deutscher Ironies of History, end footnote. Evidently, Deutscher considered it preferable or inevitable that Russia should undergo the unpleasant transition to advanced industrialization under the auspices of Stalin rather than the likes of Milyukov or Kerensky. Milyukov was the leader of the Cadet Party, and Kerensky was the leader of the provisional government between February and October 1917. Pavel Milyukov was a Russian historian and liberal politician who lived from 1859 to 1943. Milyukov was the founder, leader, and most prominent member of the Constitutional Democratic Party, known as the Cadets. Milyukov changed his view on the monarchy between 1905 and 1917. In the Russian Provisional Government, Milyukov served as foreign minister, working to prevent Russia's exit from the First World War. And Alexander Kerensky, who lived from 1881 to 1970, Jesus Christ, old guy, was a Russian lawyer and revolutionary who led the Russian Provisional Government and short-lived Russian Republic for 3 months from late July to early November 1917. After the February Revolution of 1917, Alexander Kerensky joined the newly formed Provisional Government, first as Minister of Justice, then as Minister of War, and after July as the government's second minister-chairman. Kerensky was the leader of the Social Democratic Trudovik faction of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Kerensky was also a vice chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, a position that held a sizable amount of power. Kerensky became the prime minister of the provisional government, and his tenure was consumed with World War I. Despite mass opposition to the war, Kerensky chose to continue Russia's participation. His government cracked down on anti-war sentiment and dissent in 1917, which made Kerensky's administration even more unpopular. Kerensky remained in power until the October Revolution. This revolution saw the Bolsheviks create a government led by Vladimir Lenin to replace Kerensky's government. Kerensky fled Russia and lived the remainder of his life in exile. Kerensky divided his time between Paris and New York City. Kerensky worked for the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Didn't know he worked at the Hoover Institution. Anyway. Back to the text. This optimistic confidence in the regenerative powers of socialism without the help of any Fourth International led Deutscher into further revisions of Trotskyism after the death of Stalin. Convinced that, quote, Stalinism has exhausted Stalinism's historical function, end quote, Deutscher was remarkably ready to see fundamental socialist regeneration under Malenkov and then Khrushchev. Most people know that Khrushchev is Stalin's successor. Contrary to orthodox Trotskyism, Deutscher considered that the bureaucracy itself was capable, under the pressure of historically developed social forces, of beginning the necessary reforms. In 1953, Deutscher even asserted, quote, what Malenkov's government is carrying out now is precisely the, quote, limited revolution, end quote, envisaged by Trotsky, end quote. Deutscher, Russia after Stalin. The revelation of Khrushchev's secret speech gave further sustenance to this optimism, but at the same time drew Deutscher's attention to the ambiguities of official Soviet anti-Stalinism. Writing in the fall of 1956, Deutscher maintained that, quote, circumstances have forced Malenkov and Khrushchev to act up to a point as the executors of Trotsky's political testament, end quote. On one hand, de-Stalinization had become a social necessity owing to the economic and cultural modernization under Stalin, end quote, the resistance, bracket, to de-Stalinization, end bracket, of all these groups, quote, bureaucracy, labor aristocracy, end bracket, has proved to be weaker, far weaker than might have been expected, end quote. On the other hand, Deutscher recognized that, quote, the job which it should have been the historic right and privilege of authentic anti-Stalinists, bracket, Trotskyist or other old Bolshevik oppositions, end bracket, to tackle, has thus fallen to the Stalinists themselves, who can not tackle it otherwise than half-heartedly and hypocritically, end quote. Deutscher, Ironies of History. On balance, Deutscher seems to have had difficulty restraining the optimistic interpretation of de-Stalinization, while admitting that one might have to wait quite a long time for the replacement of the reforming Stalinists. Deutscher suggested that either a rapid transition to a non-Stalinized generation or a violent upheaval might accelerate the process. In this paragraph, Deutscher mentions Malenkov, and I want to read the intro to his biography, to his Wikipedia. Georgy Maximilianovich Malenkov, who lived from December 1901 to January 1988, was a Soviet politician who briefly succeeded Joseph Stalin as the leader of the Soviet Union. However, at the insistence of the rest of the Presidium, Georgy Malenkov relinquished control over the party apparatus in exchange for remaining premier and first among equals within the Soviet collective leadership. Georgy Malenkov became embroiled in a power struggle with Nikita Khrushchev that culminated in his removal from the premiership in 1955 as well as the Presidium in 1957. Throughout his political career, Malenkov's personal connections with Vladimir Lenin significantly facilitated his ascent within the ruling Communist Party of the Soviet Union. By 1925, Georgy Malenkov was entrusted with overseeing the party's records. This brought Georgy Malenkov into contact with Stalin, who had then successfully consolidated power as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to become the de facto leader of the Soviet Union. As a result of this association, Georgy Malenkov became heavily involved in Stalin's purges before later being given sole responsibility over the Soviet missile program during World War II. From 1946 to 1947, Georgy Malenkov chaired the Council of Ministers' Special Committee on Rocket Technology. In order to secure his position as Stalin's favorite, Georgy Malenkov successfully discredited Andrei Zhdanov's protégés Alexei Kuznetsov and Nikolai Voznesensky, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and suppressed all glory associated with Leningrad during World War II, so that Moscow maintained its image as the Soviet Union's sole cultural and political capital. Following Stalin's death on the 5th of March 1953, Malenkov temporarily emerged as the Soviet leader's undisputed successor by replacing him as both chairman of the Council of Ministers, or premier, and head of the party apparatus. However, only 9 days later, the Politburo, then known as the Presidium, forced Georgy Malenkov to give up the latter position while letting Georgy Malenkov retain the premiership. Subsequently, Malenkov contented himself serving as the Presidium's highest-ranking member and acting chairman until being eclipsed in early 1954 by the party's first secretary, Nikita Khrushchev. By 1955, Georgy Malenkov was also forced to resign as premier. After later organizing a failed palace coup against Khrushchev in 1957, Malenkov was expelled from the Presidium and exiled to the Kazakh SSSR in 1957, before ultimately being expelled from the party altogether in November 1961. Georgy Malenkov officially retired from politics shortly afterwards. After a short sojourn in Kazakhstan, he returned to Moscow and kept a low profile for the remainder of his life. So, that's who Malenkov is. Back to the text. But events did not sustain this hopeful mood of 1953 to 1956. In 1959, quote, political revolution, end quote, which Trotsky once advanced, end quote, was neither, quote, precisely, end quote, the policy of the Soviet leadership, nor its policy, quote, up to a point, end quote, according to Deutscher. It was at some indeterminate stage in the future, apparently after the time, quote, in another few years, end quote, when, quote, there will hardly be a trace left of the Russia of the musics, end quote, the peasants. Deutscher, the Great Contest. Was this an admission that Deutscher had overrated the degree of economic modernization attained by 1953? Like Trotsky before Deutscher, Deutscher had learned to his sorrow that Stalinism was not such a short episode. In his last years, like Trotsky, Deutscher clung to the hope that the dialectic would make everything right in the end, but Deutscher's analysis of the downfall of Stalinism grew quite vague. In 1965, quote, the opening and unequivocal opening of a truly new phase of the Russian, and not only the Russian Revolution, is long overdue, end quote. Because of these difficulties, Deutscher's admirer, Marcel Liebman, in introducing a reissue of one of Deutscher's works in 1968, felt obliged to improve on the prophetic powers of the writer whose foresight he had just praised. Noting that Deutscher had in 1953 considered that the USSR might revert to Stalinism, become a military dictatorship, or evolve toward democratic socialism, Liebman added that there seemed to be a fourth choice for, quote, the short and even average run. ... Soviet Russia may get bogged down in a regime which, like bourgeois societies, will aim, under the, quote, enlightened, end quote, control of its administrators, at increased consumption and an atmosphere of contentment and collective apathy, end quote. Footnote, Deutscher, Russia after Stalin, but that's Marcel Liebman, as we've just read. Anyway, back to the text. This may have a good deal to recommend it as an analysis of the Soviet Union, but it leads toward the intellectual option that Trotsky resisted so desperately in his last years, and which Deutscher too resisted, that the October Revolution had in time led to the establishment of a new form of exploitation by a ruling class. The paragraph just read referenced Marcel Liebman, who lived from July 1929 to March 1986, being a Belgian Marxist historian of political sociology and theory, active at the Université Libre du Bruxelles and Vrije Universiteit Bruxelles. I don't fucking know. I have no idea. Anyway, so that's who Marcel Liebman is. Back to the text. What has Trotskyism contributed to the understanding of Stalinism? One should at least pay tribute to Trotsky's role as a pioneer in the study of Soviet politics and society in the company of other Marxist émigrés such as Nikolevsky and Stalin. Don't know who they are. And Stalin. For some reason, I feel like Stalin was like Stalin and Menshevik. Sorry, I gotta read these at the end of them. So yeah, let me repeat that. One should not least pay tribute to Trotsky's role as pioneer in the study of Soviet politics and society in the company of other Marxist émigrés such as Nikolevsky and Stalin. But this does not speak to the broader problem of conceptualization with which this analogy is primarily concerned. Here one might hope that Trotskyism represented a challenging application of Marxist thought to the question of Stalinism. In a sense, Trotsky struggled to avoid making a Marxist analysis of Stalinism. There is something to this with respect to both the question of the origins of Stalinism and the question of its destiny. Trotsky's analysis of the origin of Stalinism could not be pressed to its conclusion without embracing the kind of classical Menshevism that he had consigned to the trash can of history in October 1917. The important factor in the rise of Stalinism, he argued, was Russia's backwardness and isolation. In this context, the factor of proletarian weariness merely follows from the struggle with backwardness and isolation. If examined thoughtfully, this seems to mean that Stalinism, the degeneration of the workers' state, came about because Trotsky, among others, had failed to heed the warning of the Mensheviks, who considered that the proletarian revolution in Russia should await the fulfillment of capitalism in Russia, by which time the expected socialization of the West should have been achieved. But this was much too unpalatable a conclusion for Trotsky and his school. In the literature of Trotskyism, this question is mainly bypassed, or simply blamed on the Social Democrats in a causal allusion to their failure to lead the revolution in approximately 1918. As for the destiny of Stalinism, the Trotskyist tradition has been unable to confront the possibility that it could be a solidly founded or a long-term phenomenon. The relationship of Stalinism to the Communist Party as an institution has never been subjected to sustained examination by any Trotskyist. The problem here is that Trotsky accepted the Leninist idea of the elite, omnicompetent party and regarded it as a model for the Fourth International. Because of this commitment, no Trotskyist, not even the quote revisionist end quote Deutscher, has thus far been able to apply Marxian analysis to the institutional basis of the political and social system of Soviet-style communism. This shortcoming is related to the Trotskyist avoidance of the problem of Stalinism outside the USSR. For understandable polemical reasons, the Trotskyists have regarded many non-Russian communist parties and states as Stalinist, but the supposedly exceptional conditions of backwardness and isolation which affected Russia in the 1920s do not explain why such bodies exist, and in such profusion. As Trotskyists have acknowledged, isolation ceased to be a factor Isolation ceased to be a factor after approximately 1950, and backwardness characterizes neither communist states like the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, nor countries such as France, in which masses of workers follow a Stalinist party not in power. It was this unwillingness of Trotskyism to analyze the institutional foundations of Stalinism that led the founder and his successors to predict the approaching downfall of Stalinism for almost half a century. Sometimes this millennium is just at hand, e.g. during the turbulence of the early 30s, the approach of the Second World War, the aftermath of Stalin's death, the Sino-Soviet dispute. At other times, a less impatient forecast appears, but Trotskyism, even in the heretical forms discussed above, has always been characterized by the conviction that Stalinism is an accidental and short-lived anomaly in history. It was Trotsky, however, who first popularized the expression, quote, Stalinism, end quote, and Trotsky and his followers have stressed that they did not conceive of this as merely the personal regime of one mortal. Having called attention to the conception of Stalinism as something more deeply rooted in the society and the political institutions of this century, the Trotskyists could not, however, follow up this insight as uninhibited Marxists without threatening their eschatological faith, which was more fundamental than their commitment to a science of society. Holy shit, dude, that fucking hits the nail on the head. I'm going to reread that last sentence. Having called attention to the conception of Stalinism as something more deeply rooted in the society and political institutions of this century, the Trotskyists could not, however, follow up this insight as uninhibited Marxists without threatening their eschatological faith, which was more fundamental than the Trotskyist commitment to a science of society. The end. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how I should best look things up. Should I look them up while I'm reading? Should I look them up after I'm reading? Should I look them up at the end of a paragraph? But I don't know. But the two people that I would like to look at are right now are Boris Nikolevsky. It says Boris Nikolevsky, who lived from 1887 to 1966, was a Russian Marxist activist, archivist, and historian. Nikolevsky is best remembered as one of the leading Menshevik public intellectuals of the 20th century. And it says that David Dahlin, who lived from 1889 to 1962, was a Belarusian-American one-time Menshevik leader and later writer and lecturer on Soviet affairs who helped Viktor Kravchenko defect in the 1940s. So, the end.